Good morning. I'm Ann Aylward. I'm Deputy Associate Administrator for Research and Innovation here at the Volpe Center at the U.S. Department of Transportation. I welcome those of you who are here in person, and thank you for remembering that we're starting a half hour earlier than usual. Also like to welcome those of you who are linking in via webinar to this, the sixth in our special series on transportation systems resilience, extreme weather, and climate change. I'd particularly like to welcome those who have linked in, including federal colleagues, state, regional, and local transportation organizations, universities, nonprofit industry reps, and the international transportation community. Those of you who were with us a couple of weeks ago will have heard that we have now linked in as far as Fiji. 2 weeks ago, we had representative from the government of Fiji on the webinar. So today I'd like to give a special welcome to the members of the transportation planning organizations that are linked in from across the country, from Cobb County, Georgia, to the Baltimore Metropolitan Council, to the Sacramento Area Council of Governments. It's good to know that we're having that kind of outreach across the nation. At the end of today's talk, there will be a question and answer period, and webinar participants are encouraged to type in their questions. It is my pleasure today to introduce today's speaker, my colleague, William Lyons, Volpe's Principal Technical Advisor for Transportation Planning. Bill's research interests include a broad range of topics, including integrated transportation planning and policy, performance-based planning, planning for megaregions, and innovative ways to incorporate considerations of climate change mitigation and resilience, sustainability, and comprehensive approaches to public health in transportation decisions. In addition to research projects, he leads Volpe's support for the Federal Highway Administration and Federal Transit Administration on regulatory reviews of transportation planning by states and MPOs. Bill was on the U.S. DOT team that established the department's Center for Climate Change and Environmental Forecasting in 1999 to address issues associated with climate change and variability. He served on the center's core team and led development of the Climate Center's strategic plan and research reports on greenhouse gas reduction through state and local transportation planning and integration of climate change considerations in statewide and regional transportation planning. He has represented the Volpe Center and DOT on numerous international initiatives. He participated on international studies for the OECD and European Conference of Ministers of Transport. He coordinates our agreement with the Dutch Ministry of Transport and served with me on the U.S. DOT team reviewing transportation planning and policy in Panama. He holds a master's from University of California's Institute of Transportation Studies, another master's from the University of Lancaster in the UK, and a BA in Government and International Relations from Carleton College. Please join me in welcoming Bill Lyons.
Thank you, Ann, and thanks to Ellen for setting this up and for including me as a speaker. Okay, just a quick thumbnail sketch of what I'm going to be covering today. The focus is on transportation planning, particularly transportation planning by metropolitan planning organizations that do planning around the country for census-defined regions. The question that I'm going to explore is how these organizations and their partners can bring climate and extreme weather, resilience, and adaptation into the planning process. How can they contribute to planning resilient communities? I'm going to spend a few minutes on some key concepts, adaptation, resiliency, resilient communities. I think these are not trivial concepts. They're often used interchangeably. There's a lot of ambiguity around where one ends and the other begins, or in fact, if they're interchangeable. We're going to talk about the U.S. National Framework for Transportation Planning, established by Congress in 1991 and reauthorized every year up to now, and getting ready for reauthorization later this year. This sets a framework for how every metropolitan area in the country, over 50,000, and all state DOTs do their transportation planning. I'll give some examples of best practice approaches to climate resilience by MPOs. And then as a contrast, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Netherlands and whether or not they provide a gold standard for resiliency and how useful that standard is. And then conclude with some observations on challenges and opportunities going forward. The perspective, Volpe's perspective on this topic has a long history. Some of these things Anne mentioned in the introduction. I think, at least for me, initial involvement came out of the Federal Interagency Working Group on Sustainable Communities, where Volpe served as executive staff for a series of interagency research groups. The one that I worked on was sustainable communities, and one of the recommendations coming out of that, and this included EPA and HUD, Army Corps of Engineers, everyone with an interest in sustainability, was for the creation of a US DOT Center for Climate Change and Environmental Forecasting. Some long-standing international work on sustainability with climate change is a major aspect. We at Volpe had the opportunity to work for the Chicago MPO on their Go-To 2040 long-range plan, including working on a climate change strategy for that. And then more recently, just back in January, we had a lot of activity related to specifically to this topic, including leading the organization of a TRB session on MPOs and resiliency, and a follow-up workshop with our partners from Federal Highway and the Netherlands at the Dutch Embassy, further exploring the topic. And actually, those are the sources of some of the examples that I'll give today. And then a series of ongoing and completed best practice planning studies, all of which either directly or indirectly touch on resiliency, everything from health to mega regions to performance-based planning. All these deal with integrated planning, ways of bringing other goals and national priorities into the metropolitan and statewide planning process. And then finally, a couple of examples drawn from some work going on at Volpe for Federal Highways on climate change scenario planning. Some key concepts on the topic of, often there's a juxtaposition between mitigation and adaptation or response to climate impacts. Define mitigation as reductions in emissions, that adaptation is preparing or adjusting for climate change with an infrastructure focus. The IPCC defines it as adjusting in response to anticipated climatic effects. So very much an anticipation and a response with a focus on infrastructure. Resilience, I think, is a much more open-ended topic, and I think it does need to be distinguished. It's related to adaptation, but for me, it's not really the same thing. It's the focus on the system that's not only the multimodal transportation system, but it's the broader community system. It's all sectors, and the capacity not only to withstand shocks, to rebuild and to respond, but even beyond that, a dynamic response to survive, recover, and even to prosper. It applies to individuals, communities, institutions, and infrastructure. It requires flexibility, redundancy of processes, capacities, and responses. For example, redundancy of freight networks. So in case of extreme weather, those aren't interrupted, or evacuation and response for vulnerable populations. Planning with foresight, a multiplicity of options with a safety net. Integration into existing systems and plans. And to me, these, particularly the items in red, I think relate well to the planning framework in the US. I think that framework provides some very, very promising opportunities to address resilience. A broad view, and I should say that most of this definition is drawn from the Rockefeller white paper that's cited there at the bottom. A broad view of community resilience from Professor Eric Kleinenberg. Increasingly, governments and disaster planners are recognizing the importance of social infrastructure. So that's social infrastructure in addition to physical infrastructure. The people, places, and institutions that foster cohesion and support. Effective climate proofing should provide benefits not just when disaster strikes, but day to day, like Singapore's Marina Barrage, which created new waterfront and parkland. And that's this concept of a silver lining, as much as you don't want to look at disasters as having a silver lining, I think this approach to resilience really opens up the topic, looks longer term, looks at opportunities rather than just maybe preparing and responding. Hopefully, most of you were able to attend Dr. Kerry Emanuel's last resilience presentation, which was really an excellent one, and he provided this slide, which you may remember, which I think is for my purposes, a key point of reference, a point of departure. If this is the forecast, a good picture of risks and vulnerability, this is really the problem that is confronting every country, every community. It's a probability distribution that indicates, with the assumption that carbon level in the atmosphere doubles, this is a probability distribution of the likelihood of different degrees of warming. So if this is the science and the knowledge and the database and the forecast basis coming from the IPCC, this is one part of the equation that I'd like to look at. In addition, just to establish the currency in the president's budget that just came out in the last few days, you can see the priority given to climate resilience, taking a wide range of steps to up our game in promoting preparedness for and resilience against the impacts of climate change. It includes robust support for state, local, and tribal preparedness, analysis of vulnerabilities, creation of incentives to address these vulnerabilities, and development and dissemination of better information and planning tools. So certainly we're on the right track in giving our attention and concern to the planning process. For metropolitan planning organizations, these are federally defined in federal statute and requirements and legislation. They're not monolithic organizations that have discretion for making decisions. They are collaborative organizations. You could say they provide a big table around which all partners, stakeholders, DOTs, transportation providers, ports, airports, transit agencies sit in reaching agreement and collaborating on the long-range plans that guide the community and the investments that respond to the priority problems and needs of which resiliency could be one. Nevertheless, these MPOs, like the state DOTs, have responsibilities that are formally defined. They follow a consistent framework that I'll summarize next. And so it's collaboration, which sounds kind of soft, but it's a framework which is very, very firm and established and provides some very important opportunities for addressing community problems, including resilience. Just some key aspects of that federally defined framework. Flexibility. So it's required, but allows flexibility for each community and state to adapt it. It encourages a long-range perspective, strategic planning, focus on the multimodal system, and particularly in the last legislation, a focus on performance. It focuses on key products. So every state, every MPO, you could go to their website and find their 20-year plan. You could find their 4-year investment program. That's consistent. That's standard, with strategic thinking encouraged throughout, and an emerging emphasis on performance. This is just a schematic here of the overall planning process, and I think for our purposes for resilience, the things to concentrate on are these boxes. These are decision points. This regional vision and goals is encouraged. These are required, as I said, the 20-year plan and the 4-year program of investments, and now the monitoring of performance with a set of 6 federally defined goals. For performance-based planning, that's a new aspect and emphasis and principle in the current legislation called MAP 21, and it's an application of performance measurement in the planning and programming or investing process. It includes federally required plans and processes, including the long-range plan, which I mentioned. The law has 6 goals: safety, infrastructure, congestion reduction, system reliability, freight movement, and environmental sustainability. None of these bullets are climate or resilience, but I think it doesn't take much to see the relevance, either directly or indirectly, if not all of those, probably for most of those. The core decision points, these really are the opportunities to bring resilience solidly into the planning process, the vision, the plan, project selection, and again, performance monitoring. I mentioned the data and knowledge basis coming in from one end with Dr. Emanuel's slide. What you see is a vector of risks, challenges, problems facing communities around the world. On the other end, we have this transportation planning process, which in the US is uniformly defined and provides a foundation for addressing resilience. The question is, can this deliver on adaptation? And even more, can this deliver on resilience? And I think I'm heading toward a concept of adaptation and resilience where the two are closely related, not the same, maybe equally. You can't have resilience without adaptation, but resilience opens up much broader topics. Some best practice examples that I'll cover pretty quickly come from the TRB session in January, where we had the MPOs from New York City, Hampton Roads, Virginia, and the San Francisco Bay Area, and then the related Dutch Federal Highway Workshop at the Dutch Embassy. Two examples from climate scenario planning, pilots, federal highways pilots that Volpe is supporting, and then a Dutch perspective. Planning a future below sea level was their title. For the Bay Area, you see a continuation of analysis, much of it funded through federal pilot funds through the Federal Highway Administration. They're concentrating in this last phase on a section of the East Bay, Oakland and Alameda along the bay. There is a myriad of vulnerabilities there, both business and residential, but for transportation, everything from the BART Cross Bay Tunnel, Oakland Airport, major interstate, major port, the Bay Bridge, so lots of vulnerability. This is, I think, what you could consider a data and analysis and knowledge basis. The question is, when that study is done, what will they do with the information? You can see that included in the objectives for their analysis are social equity, economy, environment, and governance. This particular MPO is a national leader when it comes to performance-based planning and bringing goals like these sustainability goals into the planning process. So I think this is a very interesting one to watch, to see how they translate the data that comes out of their risk analysis into their long-range planning process, how they develop performance measures to bring that into performance-based planning. So this is really a very exciting and promising example. The post-Sandy planning, maybe one difference with San Francisco is that this was in response to Sandy, whereas in San Francisco is really more in anticipation of risks and dangers. Funded with a federal highways major planning grant. NIMTIC, the New York MPO, is working with its peers from around the region, not only northern New Jersey, but also Connecticut, beginning with a plan to restore services, assess damage, and repair projects. So a major infusion of funds to accomplish that. But then looking beyond that, looking at how they can incorporate resilience into the planning process, looking at where the most vulnerable links are, collaborating among their partners, because what we see is a very structured and established MPO planning process, but what does it mean to go outside the MPO's designated boundaries? So in the New York metropolitan area, you start off with a challenge in that there are two major MPOs for that single metropolitan, number one largest area, North New Jersey MPO and New York City MPO, then coordinating even beyond that jurisdiction because the risk is of a broader geographic area. So very interesting on this is how MPOs coordinate with each other as well as the multiple DOTs and the transportation agencies. So that's a big part of this effort. They expect to add a resiliency goal to their 20-year plan, which I think will be very important. And then from that, you could expect to come more specificity in terms of prioritized investments, bringing in the performance measures that are now the emphasis. Then the third example is from Hampton Roads, Virginia, major vulnerability from sea level rise. Their innovative activity is a partnership with the the military and the naval facilities because of the vulnerability of the naval ports and the vulnerability of the roads and access. So here you see another building of the knowledge base, quantitative and looking longer term to bring the results of that into the planning process, where again, like the other MPOs, they expect to have a resiliency goal. In the long-range plan, they have a very nice established tool for prioritizing projects, not in the 4-year plan, but in the 20-year plan, and they expect to add a resiliency criterion that will let them factor in the importance of resiliency in each of the investments they're considering. Then a couple of quick examples from scenario planning efforts, one in Cape Cod, which was completed. These are supported by federal highways with Volpe assistance. Here's one that is definitely sea level rise. As New Englanders, we know that's all surrounded by a lot of sea and risk. Again, the scenario planning allows them to look much longer term, to look at a range of different possibilities to get stakeholders to the table to think about the future and the risk specifically related to resilience, but in combination with all the other challenges facing the area from economic growth, sprawl, development, to bring climate concerns directly into that, led by the MPO. And then another one that is underway in Albuquerque, New Mexico. That's an interesting one because I think often when you think of resiliency, you think of sea level rise. Here's one that's looking specifically at drought and periodic flooding, and using this as an opportunity to examine growth patterns, working with a range of stakeholders from federal lands agencies to tribes, and led by the MPO, with the expectation that the scenario that gets picked coming out of this will then shape the long-range plan and ultimately future investments. The Dutch resilience is a useful model. I think it presents a gold standard of what a resiliency looks like and a resilient community. The Polder model, Polders are dikes. The Netherlands has a long history of surviving through cooperative initiatives at below sea level. So they have a multi-layer approach: protection, flood-proof, and disaster management, major infrastructure investments in seawalls along the coast, delta works around the major port of Rotterdam. The Dutch have managed to improve public life, public space, and the landscape at a fraction of the billions American taxpayers pay out for repairing hurricane damage. And that's, again, this idea that this is a much broader, I mean, they're confronting the need to survive with sea level rise, but at the same time, they're looking for a future of resiliency and prosperity. It is a useful benchmark, I think, and gold standard for a resilient community. The process that they followed to get there is probably not directly transferable, but if we see what the end state is in terms of one example of a resilient community, it's very useful to see how we might approach that through our context, including the planning framework. A nice, very Dutch image of this approach. It's a three-layered approach: protection, land use, and preparedness. So here you see the immediate response, evacuation. There, one principle is building up, so rescuing. Here's a helicopter. Then preparing for safety, and then later for prosperity here. And I think they provide a great example. Now, on our TRB panel, we had those three MPOs, New York, Hampton Roads, and San Francisco, but then we also had one of the lead Dutch ministry climate analysts as a commenter. And as much as we expected to really want to be impressed by what they're doing, it turns out he was very impressed by the MPOs. And that idea that there is a systematic approach that they're each taking, that it's built on a national framework with a lot of room for adaptation, including different goals and different values in each community, I think struck him as very interesting. And he had very encouraging things to say about each of those examples. To start wrapping up here, I guess My favorite slide here, and I was a planner, everything's sort of relativistic, yes, no, full, empty. I think there are a lot of things in place or potentially in the US in terms of the planning process, both in things that are happening and things that potentially could happen within the framework. But then there also is a hard reality of things that are going to be very difficult to accomplish. As far as how the planning process can help address resilience, this is on the half full side, it's that national framework. And I think when you see the examples, the 2 scenario planning, the 3 MPO examples from TRB, what you see is an adaptation of that process. I mean, of course, everything that they do is not because of that process. It's that process that does provide a solid foundation. For some of those MPOs, they probably would be well into this anyway without the federal requirements. But I think the federal requirements become particularly useful for areas that may not be so far along on this. The 3C planning, that cooperative, continuing, comprehensive principle underneath the framework, I think really lends itself to this broader approach to resiliency planning and multi-sectoral solutions, transportation as well as land use, economic development, and the flexibility for each area to define it for themselves. And also that principle that the MPOs are fundamentally consensus building organizations. And that I think the vision and scenario planning, as we saw in the Albuquerque and the Cape Cod examples, I think are really good examples of how other countries can begin to address this, probably in a less threatening way, because then you're looking out 30, 40 years, and then you can put some big issues on the table. What are the challenges? This is the half-empty part of it. You can only go so far with voluntary approaches. A lot of these things ultimately will end up creating ad hoc or special purpose initiatives. There's no formal responsibility for resiliency planning in the sense that there is, let's say, for air quality planning under the federal transportation legislation and the Clean Air Act. There isn't an equivalent for that. There is no federal goal of the 6 in the transportation legislation that's climate specific. Capacity limitations. You're dealing with organizations that are really strained to keep up with just their fundamental responsibilities and to pay for the projects that they need to meet the current goals, to say nothing of completely new goals. That came up in the panel, I think particularly from NMTIC, New York City. We're going to do this analysis. We'll see where the vulnerabilities are. We'll see where the opportunities are to cooperate. But then where are we? We can pool the funds that we have, maybe do some things more efficiently and smarter things, but at the end of the game, there are going to be some major changes that are going to be necessary coming out of this analysis. And how will those be funded? The private versus public risk, this is something that Dr. John has talked to me about. The insurance side, how does the insurance side with rapidly rising insurance rates for vulnerable properties, how does that get factored into the public sector planning process? That idea of what is a resilient community, as much as it's open-ended, the risk is it too open-ended? There always is the danger with things like sustainable communities, livable communities, that there is no one single uniform definition. And if resiliency, and I see a lot of publications that say resiliency, and then you open that up and they're talking about local agriculture, or they're talking about all kinds of different things that are not necessarily climate resiliency. There's the danger of the ambiguity, but on the positive side, I think it's a healthy ambiguity, especially if it's something that can be engaged in through the planning process with some specificity, with data, with performance measures that then encourage trade-offs. But the challenge is to translate resiliency into that kind of terminology. So that's the idea of the silver lining. And then finally, to conclude that there's nothing like best practices. I think we can learn a lot from the US best practices, but also international best practices as well. At that Dutch climate forum, after TRB, we had great presentations from Denmark and Norway as well on what they're doing. And our presentations were quite a bit on the planning framework, the MPOs and the DOTs, which they found very useful. And that's the conclusion. So we have some resources, like I think a list of documents from the case study MPOs that will eventually get up on on the website in case folks are interested in that. But thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a terrific presentation, a lot of material in a short period of time. As I said before, some of you came in. Bill is on travel starting this afternoon, so he needs to leave in 10 minutes. But we'll have time for a few questions. So,
or you know where to find me. Yes.
I have a webinar question. For Cape Cod or the San Francisco airport, can you identify any specific actions and their cost?
I can't. I'm not familiar with those at that level of depth, but I would encourage you, and I think for the San Francisco one particularly, we have a lot of resources that they provided for TRB to their past studies. The example that I used was of the Oakland airport, so certainly there's a really detailed study of that, but as far as the San Francisco airport, I'm not sure. That may have come up earlier. There are very good contacts there that could help, and I'd be happy to pass on the information through my email. Nick?
So I'm a planner for the FTA, and I like this idea of key decision points in the planning process, because mostly how I interact with MPOs is sort of reviewing their planning documents and giving them ideas for how to go forward. Do you have any more thoughts on specific things MPOs can do at those decision points to encourage resiliency?
Well, I would say maybe putting aside the vision and the scenario planning, I mean, that would be one very good place, but as I mentioned, that's not required. That's a kind of a best practice.
Like things in their
Yeah.
long-range plan or tip?
I would say in the long-range plan, definitely a resiliency goal or an adaptation goal. It may be that the adaptation goal is something that's easier to get a grip on. I think probably translating that into using performance measures to translate that into targets for progress, which is really where a long-range plan really starts to move ahead beyond good intentions to actually shape results, is much more difficult. And I think that's something that is just going to have to evolve, but hopefully it will be evolving fairly quickly. I think for the other key decision document, the Transportation Improvement Plan, which is the program, which is the 4-year plan, you could have simple resiliency criteria that could be as simple as, is this a vulnerable area? And in that tip, they're comparing alternative investments for different corridors, road projects. Is this something that includes a resiliency plan? These are kind of qualitative types of things, but I think maybe the next challenge is to translate that into more quantitative measures. As part of resilience, you would have the emergency response and evacuation. So if someone was trying, a transit agency was trying to get funding through the MPO process for transit, if they could establish that it serves vulnerable populations with a certain extent of mobility limitations, maybe that could be some points that could go into the criteria. And I think the performance-based monitoring is, again, a further challenge. And that's where I would look to MPOs like MTC, which is really a national star, or the Philadelphia MPO in performance-based planning. Anytime you see an MPO that is really moving ahead quickly on performance-based planning and has a priority for climate, whether it's mitigation or resiliency, I think you can have some high hopes that they'll really be doing some groundbreaking work.
I have another webinar question. Are any federal agencies giving DOTs and MPOs guidance about what likelihood to assume for different kinds of climate impacts? And is it just go look at latest IPCC findings?
I don't know the answer to that, other than that Federal Highways particularly has a lot of pilots. And from the pilots, they're generating reports that I think are resources for DOTs and MPOs around the country. So certainly I would look at the Federal Highway Administration website for climate adaptation pilots. And there are a lot of pilots across the country. They've been in place for years and evolving. So I think that's a primary form of technical assistance. That's the one I can think of. Anna?
And I know that, the focus for this discussion was on resiliency and adaptation. Do you see, has the discussion really shifted away from mitigation and towards adaptation and resiliency, or do we still hear
that's-
much discussion of mitigation?
That's a kind of a subjective view. I think just from my experience, which was pretty detailed a few years ago and less detailed more recently, I think the emphasis has always been on the adaptation. Maybe the resilience is coming into play as a more common word. But I think one thing that adaptation and resilience have going for them is that I think the public and the political decision makers understand that and understand the threat without getting into a long discussion about the human causes of global warming, which seems like that's more of a stall in this country. But as far as the immediate response, and I had an example from a few weeks ago at the National Smart Growth Meeting in Denver, where there were mayors from large cities and small cities talking about, and they use the concept of the silver lining, which is we had a major flood, we had fires, we had droughts. This is Montana and Wyoming, and we use this as an opportunity to step back and rethink our future, and that maybe we would need to do some land use changes and need to do some reshaping. I think the mitigation was pretty well established, I think, by many states that have greenhouse gas reduction plans and MPOs, and those have been worked in, like the example from Chicago, where their Go-To 2040 plan has a Chicago City Mayor's climate change plan with targets and metrics, and that's worked right into the long-range plan. So there are a lot of good examples of that. But I think the real emphasis, and this may be coming out of Sandy and some of the other items, is resilience, and there certainly seems to be funding following that in response. But the question is, can that funding anticipate it rather than have to respond to it after there's been a disaster?
Jeff Rosenblum with the City of Cambridge. So the state of Massachusetts and the Boston MPO has an emphasis on mode shift to non-automobile modes as a goal, and part of that is based on the prevention aspect of how can we prevent the climate change from happening, and as you said, also dealing with, well, it's going to happen, so we need to deal with resiliency at the same time. But one of the struggles is that, and I don't know if you have a sense, that I think people still don't necessarily agree and that transit is going to be more resilient than automobiles in the longer term. And so there's these dual goals of having more people, having smart growth and having more people take transit, biking and walking, and that helps in prevention of climate change as well as resiliency. But other people are saying, well, no, we need more people to have their own personal automobile because that will make them more resilient. Do you have a sense? And so those two things are going to become tension items in the MPO when money decision-making gets made around funds.
Well, I think it certainly depends on the different communities, but as we've seen in communities like New Orleans that needed sudden evacuation, just the gridlock and the traffic jam and the vulnerability of people without cars, it seems like that emergency response element is really a perfect one for multimodal planning, and that includes all modes together. So if you have a transit option, how do you get people to the transit who don't have cars? It just seems like that's a really logical way to bring that in. None of our best practice examples, as much as they wanted to hear it from peers, brought forward those sorts of examples. But I think resilience fits in very well into that way of thinking.
You just turned into a pumpkin. Thank you very much. Join me again, and thank you, Bill, for a terrific